Hello. Today I'm going to be responding to a white nationalist YouTuber by the name of Alternative Hypothesis. Alternative Hypothesis, a couple of months ago, released a video entitled Contrapoints, Still Stupid, whereby he's responding to a video made by leftist YouTuber Contrapoints that discusses racial injustice. Alternative Hypothesis in his video makes a number of claims that are not only outright dubious, but seem to be fairly common talking points on the right, and thus warrant a response. I'm not going to be responding to every single one of his arguments, since my video will be long enough, so I'll just be responding to the ones that seem most relevant. So without further ado, let's get started. First, we're going to be analyzing Alternative Hypothesis' claims about police bias against blacks within the United States.
Your point with this is that cops are unfair to blacks, and there's a few ways we know this isn't the case.
So before I respond to his claims, I'm actually going to be presenting research of my own for racial bias within the police. This is because I feel it'll be easier to make clear responses to his arguments once I get the explanation for the evidence that I'll be using out of the way. So first, let's look at stops and searches. According to Pearson et al. From Stanford University, looking at 63.7 million state patrol stops from 20 different states, found that officers generally stop black drivers at higher rates than white drivers, and after the stop, black and Hispanic motorists are about twice as likely to be searched when compared to white drivers. And this disparity in searches may very well stem from racial bias, since the paper found that in almost every location they considered, the threshold for suspicion and evidence required for a search was generally lower for both black and Hispanics when compared to whites. For sake of time, I won't go into exactly how this was calculated. I'll link the study in the description if you're curious. Meanwhile, in Chicago, black and Hispanic drivers were searched approximately 4 times as often than white drivers. Yet the Chicago Police Department's own data shows that contraband was found on white drivers twice as often than black and Hispanic drivers. Now let's look at police violence. According to a study conducted by Cody T. Ross of UC Davis, looking at data from 2011 to 2014, found that the probability of being unarmed, black, and shot by the police is about 3.49 times higher than the probability of being white, unarmed, and shot by the police. In fact, the probability of an unarmed black being shot by police is about the same as the probability of an armed white being shot by the police. Essentially, when it comes to shootings, police are treating black people without a weapon about the same as they treat white people with a weapon. Now, you might be thinking, well, blacks commit more crime, so they're obviously going to be interacting with the police more often, and thus are going to be more likely to get shot. However, this is not supported by the evidence. The same study also finds that racial disparities in police shooting is not reliably associated with disparities in crime. In fact, crime in general is not correlated with the likelihood of a police shooting. Next, according to a report released by the Center for Policing Equity, analyzing data from 12 geographically diverse police agencies, found that blacks were still more often targeted for use of force, even when controlling for violent crime rates. At the very least, they conclude that violent crime is not enough of an explanation for the disparity of use of force. In yet another study by Nix et al., analyzing 990 police shootings in 2015, found that more unarmed black civilians were shot than unarmed white civilians, even though whites make up a much larger proportion of the population. Also, and this is important, black civilians were no more or less likely than white civilians to have been attacking police officers or other civilians when they were fatally shot by the police. I think I've made it clear that there exists at least some form of police racial bias. Now that we know this, let's take a look at Alternative Hypothesis' specific arguments.
First is that the racial ratios of the National Crime Victimization Survey and police arrests line up almost perfectly over the long run. If cops are unfairly targeting blacks, well, then I guess there's a whole conspiracy across the whole United States for people to claim to be victims of crime that just so happens to line up perfectly with police reports.
So his argument here is that arrest rates for violent crime match the rates for reports for violent crime, which means that police aren't acting biased when arresting blacks for violent crime. The problem is that this doesn't negate all the evidence presented above in regards to police bias when it comes to traffic stops, searches, shootings, use of force, etc. All this argument shows is that police don't act in a very biased manner when arresting people for violent crimes, but it doesn't show that the police don't act in a biased manner for everything else. In fact, we'd expect the police to act less biased in this example, since arresting people for rape, assault, and murder require much less discretion by the police officer, since usually you would already have a description of the suspect or some clue as to who you're looking for, so there's less room for bias. Meanwhile, in actions that require a large amount of discretion, such as shootings, searches, stops, and use of force, we find evidence of bias. This is exactly what we would expect if the police acted in a biased manner. We're going to talk more about discretion later on, though, so just hang tight with that.
The second reason we know cops aren't unfairly anti-black has to do with cop killers. Blacks make up 44% of the people who kill a policeman, but only 30% of those killed by a policeman.
Well, the killing blow to this argument is in the data I presented earlier. Nix et al. Makes it clear that blacks who were killed by cops were no more or less likely to be threatening the cop or another civilian during the interaction than a white killed by the cop, even though blacks are more likely to be killed. What this implies is that even though cops are more likely to be killed by blacks, this is not an adequate explanation for the disparity in those killed by cops. The error alternative hypothesis makes here is that he assumes that what is true for the general population must therefore be true for a subsection of that population. Sure, in general, blacks are more likely to attack a cop, but this can't be an explanation for blacks being more likely to be shot by cops, since the Nix evidence makes it clear that people killing cops are not the same people as those getting killed by cops.
The third reason we know cops aren't unfairly targeting blacks is that when cops are required to wear a body camera, they're actually more, not less, they are more likely to shoot a black person than when they're not wearing a body camera.
Even if we accept his argument on face, it's not very compelling. Given the evidence we already have regarding the fact that blacks shot by police weren't any more likely to be threatening the police officer than whites, and given the evidence suggesting that unarmed blacks are just as likely to be shot than armed whites, unless he can reconcile the evidence I presented earlier with the body cam analysis he's presented, it's far more likely that the increase of lethal force when an officer has a body cam is not due to black people deserving to be shot more by the police. Body cams may even be beneficial for problematic cops. We already know that subjective interpretations of video evidence is easily malleable. Two people can watch the same video and come to different conclusions. Along with this, when presented in front of a jury, all an officer needs is a quote-unquote reasonable perception of a threat to justify use of force, even if a threat isn't actually present. So if the civilian makes a slight movement on video that may in the slightest way have been interpreted as somebody reaching for a gun, the officer is going to be exonerated. And it may be easier to present that kind of evidence when the officer has a body cam.
And the last thing to consider among blacks is their disproportionate number of homicides compared to other crimes. Homicides have a dead body, and most of the time it's not a mystery whodunit. So we can compare homicides to other crimes and see that blacks are more overrepresented in homicides than they are in other crimes like rape, robbery, assault, which are all going to be massively influenced by reporting bias and by what the cops happen to catch. But homicide, this is much harder to hide, and the cops don't really have a lot of discretion on that. On crimes where there's more subjectivity, more reporting issues, and the cops have some discretion whether or not to prosecute, blacks are actually less overrepresented than they are for homicides.
Okay, I have 3 issues with this argument. First, it relies on the assumption that just because blacks commit one crime at a given proportion, that proportion must be universal among all other crimes. But this makes no sense. Like, why couldn't it be the case that blacks aren't as overrepresented when it comes to rape and assault, because proportionally speaking, they simply don't commit as many rapes and assaults as they do murders? 2, it's just false. Look at rapes to see what I'm talking about. Rapes actually have very little discretion, since the victim often knows who their rapist is. Very low amount of discretion, but blacks aren't as overrepresented. Which doesn't really give credence to the idea that arrest rates are lower when you have more police discretion and higher when you have lower police discretion, like what you claim. Also, look at robberies. It's right up there with murders, but that one is likely to be one of the crimes with the most amount of discretion. Overall, simply looking at arrest rates and trying to draw any conclusion about bias isn't going to be very helpful. 3, he mentions discretion to prosecute by the officer, but this just shows how little he understands these issues, since when it comes to discretion on whether to prosecute, the cops aren't the ones who decide that. That's usually decided by either the victim or a district attorney. Now, alternative hypothesis is going to start talking about blacks and crime. We already talked about how crime rates are not a good predictor of the likelihood of police violence, but this issue is good to address even on its own, so let's take a look.
A study by Capasoa, Brialt, and Harrison in 1995 actually found that, with several other factors seen here controlled for, the percent black beat out every factor for property crime except education level, population change, and percent urban, right? Education level of an area positively correlating with property crime. But the percent black in an area was the best predictor for violent crime.
First, let's look at his study. Now, Capasoa, Brault, and Harrison do find that percent black is a strong predictor for crime within a county. So it seemed to support the idea that there is something inherent within blacks that leads to higher crime, something outside environmental forces. It's surprising then that the authors of this study state, and I quote, "We conclude that race and ethnic-specific explanations of crime are unwarranted." End quote. This would fly in the face of the notion that inherent attributes predispose blacks to crime, since that in itself would be a race-specific explanation, which the authors say is untenable. So how do the authors reconcile findings that seem to suggest an inherently racial component to crime with the conclusion that race-specific explanations are unwarranted? Well, out of their larger sample, they also conduct regression estimates for counties that were above 25% black. What they argue is that, and I quote, "If race and ethnic-specific explanations of crime are superfluous, then we would expect such variables that strongly predict crime in the general population, to be crime factors in areas where these groups are strongly represented." They then find that once you look at counties that have a population above 25% black, the proportion of the population that's black no longer becomes a strong predictor of crime, and the authors even note that the variable is no longer related. Meanwhile, poverty and urbanity become the strongest predictors of crime. They also did the same analysis for Native Americans and Hispanics and got similar results. Now, unless you were to argue that the natural propensity of black people to commit crime somehow diminishes as the proportion of the black population in a community increases, which would be nonsensical, along with the fact that the authors point out that such a relationship between crime and percent black is implausible, then this would be the exact opposite of what we would expect if blacks were more predisposed to crime by nature or by culture. There would be no reason why percent black would no longer be a predictor of crime once the proportion of black people in a county reached a certain point. No, rather, if blacks are naturally predisposed to crime, we would see this relationship no matter what. This is why, in regards to why crime in minority communities is so high, that the authors conclude that, and I quote, "There are more plausible factors that these groups share, notably poverty, divorce, and population density in the case of homicide, urbanity and population density for violent crime, and at least urbanity for property crime, and that the weight of evidence suggests that the major causes of crime in areas in which blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans are strongly represented are the same factors that explain crime elsewhere. Thus, the data suggests that race and ethnic-specific explanations of crime are not necessary." End quote. This is his very own study. And while his study does find that percent black is a strong predictor for crime, they don't reach the same conclusion that he does. Wow. Funny that data supports his conclusions only if you ignore the evidence that goes against his claims. Go figure. Much of the data regarding this topic is admittedly conflicting, and there are a lot of areas where there still is not a general consensus. Given that, here's a summary of what I was able to find, and I'm going to be quickly listing studies here, so feel free to read these studies for yourselves. If you're curious, I'll link them in the description. So first, a study by Julie Phillips from Rutgers University in 2002 found that if African Americans had the same level of advantage as whites, the homicide differential between whites and blacks would be reduced by just under 70%. And levels of advantage and disadvantage are measured by differences in poverty, education, unemployment, income inequality, etc. You can read the study for yourself if you want a more in-depth analysis. For whites and Latinos, the number is 93.9%. Interestingly, if whites had the same level of disadvantage that Latinos face, 152% of the gap would be explained, indicating that if whites were just as disadvantaged as Latinos, Latinos would have a lower crime rate than whites. Pretty interesting to say the least, but the bottom line is that the vast majority of the black-white crime disparity is explained by variables of disadvantage. Now, you may be thinking, well, what about that last 30%? Well, the study also looks at what are called differences in process, or rather, not just how certain variables affect crime rates among whites and blacks, but how those variables affect whites and blacks differently. The study finds that differences in process account for the remaining disparity, rendering the hypothesis that blacks are just, by nature, predisposed to crime, unsupported. Of course, the study doesn't outright disprove that hypothesis, but it's pretty damning evidence against it. Another study by Light and Ulmer in 2016 found that disproportionate levels of disadvantage and segregation are the strongest predictors of racial disparities in crime, indicating that socioeconomic disparities play a large role in explaining the black-white crime differential. And yet another study by Stolzenberg et al. In 2006, looking at 91 different cities across the United States, found that the percent black variable had statistically insignificant effects on violent crime within a city, indicating that when controlling for other factors, blacks don't increase crime. It seems then that other factors are at play when it comes to crime, not necessarily race, or not necessarily an inherently racial component. And lastly, a study by Sampson, Moranoff, and Rodenbush in 2005, looking at data from Chicago between 1995 and 2002, found that over 60%, in fact close to 70%, of the black-white violent crime gap and about 100% of the Hispanic-white crime gap can be explained by marital status of parents, how recently your family immigrated, and dimensions of neighborhood social context, such as socioeconomic status, education levels, etc. Interestingly, since alternative hypothesis here is a race realist, although low IQ is a predictor of violence, this study also found that disparities in IQ accounted for a very small amount of the black-white crime gap and is statistically insignificant in explaining the Hispanic-white crime gap. What this indicates is that differences in IQ cannot explain differences in crime rates. It's also interesting that this study, when not accounting for differences in process, got extremely similar results as the Phillips study. I wonder why that is. This study also conducts a robustness test to determine whether it's disparities in socioeconomic status causing disparities in crime or the other way around, by controlling for crime rates prior to 1995 and checking to see if it was past crime playing a role here. But the findings were for the most part consistent with the original analysis, even after controlling for past crime. So in general, the data seems to suggest that environmental factors, such as disadvantage, urbanity, etc., are better explanatory variables when discussing racial disparities in crime, not necessarily an inherently racial component. Next, let's talk about education.
The way we know the bad schools myth is a myth is from a form of natural experiment called lottery voucher studies. These are useful in that everyone has an opportunity to apply for a voucher, and the people who get them are randomly selected. So we can compare the people who got vouchers to those who didn't, and it's apples to apples because everyone in the study applied for them. And we can see the results of the lottery voucher program in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, and in Washington, D.C. The effects here are still marginal.
My response to his bad schools argument will consist of two parts. First, looking at why voucher studies are insufficient, and second, my own research for bad schools. First, the problem with using voucher studies as evidence for why other schools aren't actually bad, and or why educational achievement is fixed, is that it assumes that the primary recipients of these voucher programs are low-income kids, and that private schools that participate in these programs are generally good schools. But this isn't the case. First, the students receiving vouchers aren't necessarily low income. In Milwaukee, families with an income up to 300% of the poverty threshold are still eligible for vouchers. To put that in perspective, for a 4-person family, that means they're still eligible for a voucher even if they make up to $60,000 in income. Some families with an income as high as $71,000 were still eligible. In Cleveland, it was 200% of the poverty line. Not as high as 300%, but it still should be clear that kids receiving these vouchers weren't in dire poverty. In fact, 2/3 of both Wisconsin's and Cleveland's voucher recipients were already going to a private school. Meanwhile, in DC, the percentage of students from schools, quote-unquote, in need of improvement, that were getting vouchers have been declining each year and are underrepresented. Again, sources in the description. Along with this, the private schools that do accept vouchers aren't particularly good. And we know this because of the fact that half of private schools that do accept vouchers in Milwaukee, 95% or more of their students receive a voucher. In fact, according to a study done by Ford and Anderson, 41% of private voucher schools in Milwaukee literally failed, as in they don't exist anymore. The implication is that many of these private schools would not have been receiving the vast majority of students that they currently do if it weren't for vouchers, indicating that many of these schools were actually pretty bad, but vouchers barely kept them afloat. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, the money received through these vouchers usually isn't enough to send kids to good private schools, but rather only inner-city religious schools that teach things such as the biblical creation story is literally true. In fact, that's true for over 300 voucher schools across the country. The education that these kids receive in these voucher schools is, for the most part, subpar. Lastly, in DC, according to the Government Accountability Office, some voucher schools didn't even have a majority of teachers with at least a bachelor's. Also, the voucher schools in DC spend about 65.5 less minutes per week on reading and 48 minutes less on math than DC public schools. So when it comes to vouchers, it's no surprise that students aren't doing better. But what's the evidence for poor schooling in Black communities? Well, contrary to popular belief, the United States spends quite a bit of money on education. The issue is misallocation. For example, according to the United States Department of Education, we spend about 15% less per student in high poverty districts when compared to low poverty districts. This is the complete opposite of what it should be, since generally low-income students are the ones who need more resources. Black students are more likely to be poor and thus in general are more likely to receive less resources for their education. But this is further compounded by the fact that the majority of poor whites don't live in a high poverty area, while the majority of poor blacks do. Meaning that for many poor whites, they're still going to have better access to education than poor blacks. And I'm not necessarily saying that all poor whites have a better education than all poor blacks. I'm just speaking in general. Schools with high concentrations of people of color spend about 15% less per student than schools in predominantly white districts. And spending isn't insignificant. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, a 20% increase in per pupil spending is associated with a 25% increase in earnings and a 20% decrease in the likelihood of ending up in poverty. It's not just spending though. Schools with higher levels of Black or Latino enrollment, in general, have about 2 times as many first-year teachers than schools with predominantly white students. This is also significant, since it implies that Blacks are more likely to have inexperienced teachers than whites. And I want to make something clear here. This is not necessarily a list of all the different problems that schools in Black communities face. There's a number of other issues that they face as well. Rather, I'm just providing a few small facts to try and illustrate the issue more clearly. So I hope it's clear that bad schools are an actual issue. So now let's discuss something that goes really well with schools. Drugs.
Black and white people use weed at about the same rate, but black people are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for it. And we're talking about a drug that, at this point, white America has basically decided shouldn't really even be illegal anyway.
Now, the first major problem is all these studies are based on self-report, and there's several studies I have showing that blacks are more likely to lie about using drugs. They're anywhere from twice as likely to 25 times as likely to lie about their drug use than whites are, depending on the study.
Well, looking at a study by Rose et al., which uses a larger, more geographically diverse sample than his does, blacks are no more likely to underreport marijuana usage than whites are. As in, they're no more likely to say they hadn't when they had. In fact, blacks are actually more likely to over-report both marijuana usage and cocaine usage, so more likely to say they had when they hadn't. Along with this, another study from Ledgerwood finds a very similar result. Now, to be fair, both studies did find that blacks were more likely to underreport cocaine usage. So you could say, see, blacks use cocaine more often, so that must explain the disparity in drug arrests and incarceration. However, considering the fact that cocaine only makes up about 5% of drug arrests, it's highly dubious that this alone can explain the disparity. So, I would argue that he'd be right in saying be wary of self-reports when it comes to drug usage. But the analysis is incomplete if he only says blacks are more likely to say they hadn't used drugs when they had, since 1, my data reveals that this is only true for cocaine, and 2, the opposite is also true. They're more likely to say they had when they hadn't. But let's say we accept his data as being superior. I have my doubts that this would explain the disparity. Why? 2 reasons. 1, even though disconcordance is higher among blacks according to his study, it's pretty low for all groups. His study even says this. So even if blacks are more likely to lie than whites, both are still unlikely to lie in general. 2, it ignores the other ways in which blacks face discrimination in regards to the war on drugs. Blacks are twice as likely to be convicted after being arrested for drug offenses and are more likely to be sentenced than whites. They were also 3 times more likely to be sentenced to additional jail time than whites, even after controlling for prior arrests. For marijuana misdemeanor charges, they were 2 times as likely given no prior arrests. For drug offenses, blacks also received 13.1% longer sentences than whites.
Blacks are more than twice as likely to buy drugs outside as whites are, and over 3 times as likely to buy drugs from a stranger as whites are.
2 issues. 1. This is likely the result of blacks being more likely to live in lower-class inner-city neighborhoods, where private space is more limited and people are more likely to sell in public places. So, all he's proven is that the war on drugs still disproportionately harms blacks in virtue of their socioeconomic situation. How is this any better? Why would I be okay with a policy that disproportionately harms people living in poor urban areas? 2. According to his own study, his analysis only explains a tiny part of the disparity. Here's his own author, and I quote, "Risky purchasing patterns among African Americans and their more frequent participation in transactions can account for only a relatively small amount of the observed differential in arrest rates. According to these calculations, whites should still be arrested at a rate twice that of African Americans if the only thing driving these arrests were differential purchasing patterns. Instead, we observe in the real world that it is African Americans who are arrested at a rate that is twice that of whites." End quote. So there's something at play here other than lying or irresponsible use, as evidenced by the evidence I presented earlier and his own study.
2. Redlining. The FHA adopted a policy of refusing to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods, which were colored in red on official maps.
Okay, I've been over this before in my video response to Spooge Job Soy Pants from College Humor, so alright, let's get into this. We know that since the 1950s, the black-white gap in home ownership has been roughly the same.
This is misleading. What he ignores is that the racial gap in home ownership was declining in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This decline stalled seemingly in the 1920s. According to Collins and Margot, after conducting a multivariate analysis, they found that this stagnation was at least partly due to segregation. Between 1940 and 1960, while redlining was in effect, the gap increased by 6%. Now, personally, the gap should always be decreasing, so even a small increase means that shit's fucked up. But maybe that number is too low for him. Well, even then, only looking at the overall disparity ignores the larger picture. For example, for young people, the gap doubled in size from 14% to 29%. This is important because it meant that social mobility for young blacks, at the time, was much more inaccessible, which, when compared to disparities among older members of the population, will obviously have a greater long-term effect, because what that meant was that young blacks couldn't build equity and couldn't build wealth through homeownership. The authors attribute this to a number of factors, including redlining. Essentially, sure, total disparities in homeownership didn't change much, but for young blacks it did, indicating that blacks didn't have the same access to baby boomer growth that young whites enjoyed. So, what we can see is that the homeownership gap decreased in the early 1900s, stagnated in the 20s and 30s, increased during redlining, particularly for young blacks, and then stagnated again after its removal. So overall, I think this is decent evidence that redlining had some sort of effect.
Moreover, since the 1970s, residential segregation in the United States has increased when redlining was actually outlawed.
Nope, this simply isn't true. Residential segregation has been slowly declining since the 1970s, and in all but one of the nation's 650 housing markets, the separation of black residents from other races is now lower than the national average in 1970. So his claim is an outright falsehood. So with that, that's the end of part 1. I will be addressing the rest of Alternative Hypothesis' video in part 2, so stay tuned for that. Until then, have fun, and see ya.